Greetings, Fire Chargers, Darkblade here, and in this video I will begin a series consisting of at least 3 parts. It will cover 6 views on the Exodus and when it happened. Those 6 views are, in roughly chronological order, the super early date, which is anything before 1500 BC, the early date theory, which is anything from like 1500 to 1401 BC, the mid date, which is anything from 1400 to 1301 BC, basically the 14th century BC, the earliest the 15th century, and the late date, which is anything from 1300 to 1250 BC, so the first half of the 13th century BC, the super late date, which is anything after 1250 BC, and the mythicist theory, which basically holds that the Exodus didn't even happen. Now, in this video, which is part 1, I will be covering the super early and super late dates, because those are some of the easiest to handle. Now, a super early dater is anyone who holds that the Exodus happened before 1500 BC, or during a pharaoh whose actual dates of reign were prior to 1500 BC. Now, many super early daters of that second type might on surface look like standard early daters, because most super early daters are also chronological revisionists. They push these super early pharaohs ahead in time, so that their pharaoh aligns with a more traditional early date. However, because these pharaohs actually reigned before 1500 BC, I am categorizing them as super early date theories. Some of the most well-known super early daters are David Rohl, David Down, and Dr. John Ashton, all of whom hold the Exodus to have happened during the 13th dynasty of Egypt, which ruled from about 1800 to 1650 BC, plus or minus a few years. Sam Shamoon, I think, on a live stream, he also once came out in favor of a super early date, holding the Exodus to be in the 13th dynasty, and one extreme super early dater that I have personally interacted with on Quora is Roger M. Perlman, who basically holds the Exodus to have happened in the 6th dynasty of Egypt. That's like the 23rd or 22nd century BC according to actual history. Of course, if you were to ask these people when the Exodus happened in terms of a number followed by BC, they would look like they were just normal early daters because of the chronological revisionism that they employ. However, if you ask them who was the pharaoh of the Exodus or what dynasty the Exodus happened in, it will become apparent that they are in fact super early daters and not just normal early daters. A lot of early daters are also chronological revisionists, because this at times even pushing in pharaohs is back to 30 years before they actually started their reign. But super early daters take this to another level, unparalleled, almost completely paralleled. So it's significantly greater in magnitude and opposite in direction. So a standard early dater's chronological revisionism might have pushed Amenhotep II's ascension back to around 1355 BC. 1455 BC, when he actually ascended in 1425 BC. So they'll push him back 30 years or so, which also ends up pushing his ascension back to about 10 or 11. Let me see. About 10 or 11 years prior to his actual date of birth, which is 1445 or 1444 BC. 1444, which is 1444 BC, because he became pharaoh at age 18, and 1426, 1425 BC, that's when he actually ascended. So, in early daters, chronological revisionism would just push a pharaoh back a few decades. However, a super early daters chronological revisionism involves pushing pharaohs forward a few centuries. For example, David Down and Dr. John Ashton co-wrote a basic Egyptian biblical timeline correspondence article for Answers in Genesis, in which they say that Tutmosis III was the pharaoh Shishak. So they push Tutmosis III forward 500 years. I think the main point of this is some archaeological stuff that they think correlates with what we see in the biblical account if they portray it in a certain way. But since the chronological revisionism doesn't work, or the super early date also doesn't work. And also, Exodus 1:11 records that the Israelites built stored cities in Pithom and Ramesses. Both of those cities didn't exist in any form prior to 1300 BC. So, both early daters and super early daters, and also maybe mid daters, need to say that that's either a retrojection or a redaction or some other type of updated place name, because if it isn't an updated place name and the mention of Ramses and Pithom actually are contemporaneous, then that leaves the late date as the only historicist option. Because guess what? The super late date also doesn't work. The super late date basically holds that the Exodus was after 1250 BC. Well, guess what? Israel is mentioned by name already settled in the land of Canaan in the Merneptah, which dates to around 1217 BC. And the exact line says in the exact passage that mentions them says, Israel is laid waste and its seed is not. Which, this is from 1217 BC. So the Israelites must have already arrived in Canaan by then, and they must have left Egypt at least 40 years before then. So they left Egypt no later than 1257, 1256 BC. So that pretty much rules out the entire super late date. So the super late date doesn't work because of the Merneptah, and the super early date also doesn't work because it's dependent on chronological revisionism, and also because of Exodus 1:11. You could say that. And there's also some super early daters like to basically look like early daters. They'd also use that around time 1446, 1 Kings 6:1, and Judges 11:26 to place the Exodus in the 15th century BC. In the mid-15th century BC, however, the pharaohs that they propose as the pharaohs of the Exodus actually reigned much earlier. So without that chronological revision, if those two verses are in fact literal, then the super late then the super early date also doesn't work, and neither does the super late date. Now, then again, and the mid and late dates also aren't compatible with a literalistic reading of 1 Kings 6:1. So in order for those to work, a non-literalist reading must be the correct one. So both the early and late dates are dependent on certain readings of certain passages, because if certain readings are true, then it basically acts as biblical confirmation of their position. But if said readings are false, then their position no longer has that leg to stand on. And if certain readings and interpretations of other passages are true and correct, then it's a refutation of their position. So everything except the early date is dependent on a non-literalist readings of 1 Kings 6:1, and everything and everything before the mid date, so that's the super early and mid date, are dependent on a redactionist or a retrojectionist reading of Exodus 1:11. Because if Exodus 1:11 is contemporaneous, then the Exodus must have happened after 1300 BC, which forces a late date. And if 1 Kings X1, the 480 years, is literal, then it forces the Exodus to be in 1446, around 1440s BC, which forces like a central early date. So, back to the subject of this episode, which is the super late date and the super early date. The super late date doesn't work because of the Merneptah deal, and also because you see the beginnings of Israelite material culture in the 12th or late 13th, around the 12th and late 13th centuries BC, which seems too early for a super late date to be true, and the super early date relies on impossible chronological revisionism.